going to learn about story structure in public speaking, or what we call once upon a time, which is one of the best introductions you can have when you're telling a story. Because once upon a time, by saying that, you are forced to give an introduction to your story, which covers some of the basic questions of what, where, when, how, and why. That's something which, if we say once upon a time, we have to at least partially set up our story. So within that, we're going to today talk about story structure. And within that, we're going to learn about the monomyth, or the hero's journey. Okay, has anyone here heard of the hero's journey before?
No.
If you have.
No.
All right, so it's a pretty cool writing concept, and there are many different uses that we can have, both for the speeches that we write and also for our students, of different drills to use in class. I have used multiple different parts of the monomyth to use different drills for students to use in class. So there are two types of narrative of stories: a story-driven narrative and a premise-driven narrative. So let's explain what these things are. Okay, a story-driven narrative is a single story. We can imagine this in movies and books and TV show episodes. There's a beginning to end, and the speaker relives the experience, or the viewer relives the experience with the speaker. So if there's a point, it comes at the end, but we're following a story. We're following a transaction of, like, I'd say a process. Little Red Riding Hood, for example, is a story. We start at the beginning. You know, she needs to bring food to her grandmother. She meets a wolf. She walks in the woods, and then she gets eaten by the wolf, and the hunter comes and saves them, and so on. So there's a story. We follow a character all the way through. So that's a story-driven narrative. A premise-driven narrative is one where the story exists to prove a point. The logical elements build the story step by step. The story making sense is the driving force, and the logical message continuing throughout the story is present, and it proves the argument. So for example, if we were to write Little Red Riding Hood and we wanted to give a logical message, what are some messages we could have, lessons from Little Red Riding Hood?
Messages is not to talk to strangers because they might be scary. They might do something freaky or weird.
Excellent. One of the very good, Sagit. So one of them is, talking to strangers could be bad. What are some other lessons we can get from Little Red Riding Hood?
Listen to your parents, mom, dad.
Listen to your parents. The mother says, don't go down the path. Excellent. So they want to try for one more, another lesson we can get from Little Red Riding Hood?
Don't take things for granted.
Don't take things for granted. Great. So we see all of these, and whether it's, don't be afraid to cry out for help because, the hunter, maybe heard someone scream, or just make sure if other people need your help. There are a bunch of different messages that we can take. But what if the lesson of Little Red Riding Hood is that pies are really healthy? She's bringing a pie to her grandma for being sick. Is that something which comes across in the story? Not necessarily.
No, they don't talk about it. Okay,
Exactly.
They don't talk about it.
We don't talk about it. So if we were trying, so right now we take the Little Red Riding Hood story and we see the logical outcomes of the lessons we said. There's some ideas that are very clear. But if our goal was to have a pie is healthy, or walks in the forest, or good for having you get over a cold, if that was our logical argument we want to prove, we'd have to restructure the story to make sure that idea was clear throughout. Sometimes we have stories where the moral of the story is not obvious. And in life, by the way, some of our adventures that we have that are most interesting to us as people, some of the craziest, imagine like in a vacation you took where things went wrong, there may not be a moral to the story. There may be one at the end, there may be none, but it's the story of things are happening. Sometimes there is no clear message, but it's very interesting. It's very engaging. In some longer soap operas, not every action, shows us where it's going, but we're still very engaged. Some stand-up comedy pieces, same idea, very entertaining. We're not sure where they're going. So a story-driven narrative, we're joining for the story. A premise-driven narrative, we're joining for the lesson. And premise-driven narratives are not necessarily more interesting. They need to make sense. So one of them is the speaker living through the experience. The other is the speaker living with the point of understanding the point at the end. So which one of these do you feel is more interesting for us as viewers to watch? Story-driven or premise-driven?
I
Anyone?
think premise-driven. Premise-driven, in my opinion, is my.
Okay, anyone? So, okay, let's try to take a vote. All who think story-driven, raise your hands. Okay, all who think premise-driven, raise your hands. All who aren't sure, raise your hands. All right, excellent. So usually a story-driven narrative is more interesting for listeners. It's not about the point, it's about living through the experience. It's not that merging the both can't create something very interesting, but the question is, what is the goal? For example, the TED Talks, like I talked about in previous lessons, are generally premise-driven narratives. They use story-driven narratives inside. They usually have 2 to 3 interesting stories throughout, but their goal is that you get the point. Okay? So I want to introduce a book with many, many pages. I'm not expecting people to go read this tomorrow, but A Hero with 1,000 Faces is one of those unique books that really covers a huge amount of information. Joseph Campbell, he researched thousands of years of myths. Do we know what a myth is?
Yes.
Excellent. So you research the myths and stories of different cultures around the world to see what stories survived and what they have in common. So for us, if, for example, we know Bible stories, the story of, Samson who pushed the towers, and the stories of, Abraham and different characters over history. So we have stories that survived, and they fall into, we don't know if they factually happened, but we do know the stories. Stories are part of culture. So he measured stories from different groups of people around the world, and he combined the myths with modern psychology to find the storytelling patterns. Are there patterns that transcend space and culture? Is there something you can find in common with a story that we know from the Bible and a story from, Chinese culture and Aboriginal culture and, Native American culture and so on? Like, are there themes that all of these stories had? And he found that there indeed were themes which this details changed, but the process was the same. Okay. And he called this process the monomyth, or also called the hero's journey. The monomyth examines the stages of a hero who goes on an adventure, faces a crisis, wins, and returns victorious. And he found that all over the world, this same structure existed. So let's take a look at what this structure is. So this is the hero's journey. First, there's the call to adventure. The character has a threshold, so I'm keeping them from the call to adventure. Then there is a transformation of some kind. There are helpers. There's the abyss, the dark low point, transformation of the hero, returning up, atonement, overcoming their obstacle, and finally return to the starting point, now having something they didn't have before, whether it's an object, whether it's knowledge. So this is the process. Let's go through this more in depth. Okay, so the 5-part template, and we're specifically going to focus on the inner 3, is first the introduction, describing a situation in a neutral manner, providing background and context. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived with her mother in the forest and, smelled the flowers and really enjoyed her life. We have a mental image. Our imagination showed this to us. First is the complication, to hook the audience, reveal why the world is flawed. This girl's life is great, but her grandmother is sick. Oh, something needs to be done, a change in the introduction. We then have hidden objectives, tests, allies, growth. The girl is called on adventure to bring soup or pie to her grandmother. Then she has a test. Does she go down the different path offered by this stranger? And by coming later or getting lost, there may be growth. Finally, and then you can see this happen at different points. First, she talks to a stranger. She takes the different path. She then goes and sees her grandmother looking different, but needs to figure it out for sure. And then she calls for help. And each of these points leads to the next point. Finally, there's a solution that resolves the crisis. In this story, a hunter comes in and kills the wolf and frees the girl and her grandmother. And the conclusion is bringing home the reward. For example, the lesson not to talk to strangers, or the lesson don't not listen to your mother's instructions about the path in the wood. All right, so let's take a look at the different acts and the process. Okay, so this is the once upon a time structure. And we're going to go through the different parts. But just so we have an idea here, it's Act 1 is the setup. Once upon a time sets up the story. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived with her mother and father in a cabin in the woods. And every day, something. And every day she smelled the flowers. And every day she helped out her mother. And every day she would, hear about her grandmother, who her mother loved, but was too far down the road for her to have visited any previous time. Therefore, she doesn't know the way there. So, also an every day. Until one day, her mother said, grandmother is sick, and you must take her this pie. Okay, so we see every day is said as many times as it needs to set up the story. Act 2 is because of that. And because of that, and because of that, and because of that, and because of that, which keeps going, each one setting up the next, inherently driving the story forward. Some of the stories we have the most trouble with when we watch movies or TV or books and we're not satisfied is because some things happen that aren't connected to previous things. The story doesn't drive itself forward. The heroes are stuck and suddenly a character we never heard of before shows up and magically saves the day. That's not as satisfying as watching the pieces we saw before come together. And we can all think of media we've been disappointed by. One of the bigger reasons is that there isn't the because of that connection that we're used to. And then Act 3, and when they come back, until finally something happens, until finally the hunter came and freed the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood. And since that day, Little Red Riding Hood only takes the direct path to grandma's. And since that day, Little Red Riding Hood didn't talk to strangers. And since that day, Little Red Riding Hood learned to use an axe and nobody messed with her anymore. Whichever one of these it is. And that's the moral of the story. The setup, the process where every step leads to the next, and finally the conclusion. Now, as far as motivations, the catalyst to adventure can very much fit into what we talked about in the first lesson. Remember when I talked about meaning, like what makes us even care about things? The meaning for a story, if we're thinking of our ideas, like why do we care? How do we connect it to people and ourselves? Maslow's triangle is a great place to find inspiration. We could be dealing with a physiological need. Grandma is sick. She needs this pie or she won't get better. Could be a safety need. Grandma needs this blanket. She's going to be cold. Grandma is lonely. Go visit her. Grandma should see how you learn to play the guitar. Or self-actualization. Little Red Riding Hood is preparing for a serious hiking club. And because of that, she needs to practice by going through the woods. So whether it's defending filling a minus or building above a certain point, any one of these can be a catalyst to the story. I'm a teacher and I want to present better in English. So I went to a whole bunch of professional development courses. That's self-actualization. Any one of these, if it taps into something real for us, can be a motivation for the story. Okay, so with this in mind, okay, so are we clear so far? Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about the different types of heroes and setting up the story. So Act 1, setting up the story. What type of a story are we even talking about? So can someone read the quote here? Sabina, can you please read the quote? You're on mute. Still on mute.
Sorry. Okay. Ordinary people who make themselves extraordinary.
אני לא
Excellent.
מסכימה כדור בבית, אני מזכירה לך.
All right. Well, I'm glad that,
That's not me.
yeah, that's not you. Okay. So heroes, ordinary people who make themselves extraordinary. This is already not a given. There are certain stories where the character has all the powers, all the ability, doesn't work very hard to be supernatural and excellent. That's something which not everybody does. That's not very satisfying. When we see someone like us, relatable to us, going through and overcoming, that is the part which brings satisfaction, to watch someone grow and watch someone overcome. Ordinary people who make themselves extraordinary, not someone who had it all and everything was very easy. That's not interesting for us to watch. All right, so let's look at the types of heroes. Sabina, can you read us also the first slide here?
Yeah. Intentional hero sets off on quest to achieve specific goal. Example, Hercules sets out to where is the
Hercules sets out to overcome his 12 labors. Okay, for those who can't see the last line. So an intentional hero, the first type, is someone who sets out specifically to achieve a goal of some kind from their quest. For example, in Greek mythology, the hero Hercules decides to prove himself. He's going to do 12 different quests. Okay? For example, for those who read Harry Potter, when Harry Potter takes part in the Goblet of Fire tournament, he's intentionally joining for those challenges. Okay, so that's someone choosing the adventure, knowing what they're getting into through choice. Okay, let's have someone else read. Sarah, can you please read? All right, thank you, Sabina. Sarah.
Reluctant hero, forced against their will into a journey. Example, a soldier drafted to fight in a war.
Beautiful. Okay, a reluctant hero, someone who is forced against their will into a journey. They know the dangers, but they still have to do it, though they don't want to. We can see that telling the story of one hero, a student deciding, I'm going to be the best in the country at math, is very different to a parent saying, you're not going to your summer camp program unless you become the best in your school at math. Okay, one of them is a hero choosing the adventure, an intentional hero. The other is a reluctant hero. Okay, Vika, tell us about the accidental hero. You're on mute.
Accidental hero falls into an unexpected journey. Example, went camping, bear attacked group, saved.
Everyone. Excellent. So an accidental hero is one who doesn't know about the journey and gets surprised by it. Like a camping trip where a bear attacks the group. Everyone went camping, no one knew it, and someone accidentally had to take up the role of the hero. So we have knowing about the challenge and overcoming. We have knowing about the challenge, knowing the challenge and choosing the challenge. We have knowing the challenge and not choosing the challenge. And we have not knowing the challenge and not choosing the challenge. Now, the fourth option is, where there really is no overcoming of the challenge. And that's not a story that we're interested in. So within these are the types of heroes, and even knowing this can let us set up the story differently. If you have a vacation that you were on and something exciting happened and you didn't plan for it, you're the accidental hero. But if you right now decide to learn a new skill, you're the intentional hero. And when you had to go out and get milk in the pouring rain because we're out of it, you are the reluctant hero. So in these cases, whether you choose to improve, you have to get the milk, or the tickets got canceled, you have to get new ones. These are different types of stories. Understanding that, we could set it up differently. So before the journey, Sometimes it's the journey that teaches you a lot about your destination. So first, in a story, there is a concept, refusal of the call. For the story to be interesting, we need something. The first one, we get called to adventure, we don't choose to do it. Okay, Little Red Riding Hood decided to keep smelling the flowers until she heard that the situation was too serious and she had to go. The more refusals to the call, the more barriers there are, the more impressive it is when the hero even goes to adventure. On the camping trip, everyone's in the tent, they see the bear sniffing outside. You know, maybe things will be okay. That's also, you know, a possibility. The threshold to adventure comes in many forms: physical obstacles, guardians, friends who cast doubt. All right. All this, by the way, is going to be in the slideshow that we have to like use this for when we do a drill. Okay. There can also be a mentor who gives wisdom to overcome the different parts of the process. The listener should feel the process is special, not the speaker. We want the story to be interesting. People shouldn't listen to us because of who we are. They should listen because of what we say. Eventually, the hero commits the journey. They must cross the threshold and enter an unfamiliar world. Little Red Riding Hood took the pie, left mother's house, and started walking down the path. Self-sacrifice, crossing the point of no return. She has now left the safety of home. She's now on the journey, and we move out into the world. So we see that when we're setting up the world, until the challenge starts the story, there's a whole setup which can make it more interesting to the listener. Little Red Riding Hood, who didn't want to go, who liked the flowers, who liked home, and was very happy with where she was. And in many stories, the starting point is that space. And if we think to stories we know and love, whether it's movies or books, we can see how this plays out. The beginning, the setup. I saw a fascinating play actually in London one time called The Ferryman. And in this play, the first act was like 90 minutes, just story setup. I didn't feel anything huge happened, but they showed a really rich and beautiful world. The setup can be the minimum. The setup can be longer, but eventually the journey starts and we go to Act 2. So Act 2 is something new happens that triggers the whole story. Throughout this, there's tests, but they sort of grow in strength. Difficult, but not life-threatening. There can be allies and enemies, and these can also be situational differences. First, she has to choose the path she thinks is shorter. For example, not a life-threatening test as of yet. So we can see how the struggles grow and how one choice can lead to the next one. And this is where we can see, if we look at the story, crisis, not climax, she can get lost in the wood and then find her way. So that's not as big as getting attacked by a wolf. So we can see that smaller things lead to larger ones. And eventually, though, we do reach the high point, the point where we can have her choose to see grandma look funny and still talk to her or something like that. Okay, so then we can see that from getting lost in the woods, it gets to larger types of fear. Then we can also have rewards. She finds grandma's house after getting lost in the woods. Take that path, it's faster. It wasn't faster. It was slower. She was lost. And then she saw a clearing and she recognized the oak red door that she knew was her grandma's house. So you see, there's a bit of tension and then it's released. She gets to the house. So after surviving, there's like a reward and a respite. Like she leaves the house, lost, finds, then goes and finds the wolf, you know, crisis and so on. Preparation for the final encounter. Grandma, what big eyes you have. Grandma, what big ears you have. You know, the innermost cave is with, you know, the stakes are high, you know, the wolf can jump out and eat her, whatever it is. And then the climax or final battle where the moment comes that, you know, something changes, whether it's because Little Riding Hood yelled out and the hunter heard or some other catalyst. Okay, so this is the high point. We see there's ups and downs, always working towards the climax of the story. Act 3 is returning changed. Little Red Riding Hood, like we said here excellently before, had a few different lessons that she could have learned from this. So on the road back home, the return to normal life happens, And characters can either return home, Little Red Riding Hood with her new lessons returned home to mother, or move on to a new home. Little Red Riding Hood decided grandma needs me and decided to live with her grandma to take care of her. All of these are possibilities. And either way, there's a return with wisdom. This can be, an actual object. Grandma gave wine or vinegar or, soup that mother liked, and definitely the knowledge that the hero had. So this is the three-act process. And you can see this now that we know this, we can apply it to different, to different stories that we've seen and that we know. So let's take a few, and any questions on this? Awesome. Okay. I think it's very exciting to learn conceptually. So storytelling lessons, let's take a few lessons from this. So first, telling your story. Personal experiences or observations, a greatest lesson ever learned. They're like different ideas we can use, like we learned, to kick off our story. If you can go back in time and give yourself a lesson, what would it be? We can use here anchoring and triggering like we learned. Show, don't just tell. And we're going to do that when we practice. You want to recreate your experience on the stage. You want authentic characters who are more complex. You want to reenact what you feel. And this is where specifics and details come in. Like I said here, dialogue versus narration. If you can say right now, for example, we have the story of the vacation that we talked about where, things went wrong. So you could say like, I said to my partner, where are our keys? And my partner said back, I thought you have them. It's better than we asked each other for the keys and realized they were lost. Dialogue really also helps the audience get into it. Next is the thing we learned last 2 weeks ago. Specific, the spice for making a story real. Specifics make a proper setting, names, titles, details. It's not when we traveled, we had a problem. Our wheel busted. Our tickets got canceled. Our suitcases got sent to the Czech Republic. These are things that happen. Audiences don't connect to generalizations. The more specific we are, the more the story helps. And for examples of specifics, like I said, he lived at home versus David lived in Odessa on Stepova Street. She learned a skill to overcome the teaching obstacle. Debbie learned to use Zoom, asked a mute feature to get specific students speaking more during class. Okay, so these are the different ideas that we can use for specifics that we're going to practice. Okay, so with all that said, are there any questions on any of this? Excellent. Okay, so thank everyone very much. And